Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? The biggest day of my life had empty family seats, not because of some traffic jam or last-minute emergency, but because the people I had bent over backward to support decided together that their absence would teach me a lesson. I stood on that stage, looking straight into a camera lens instead of familiar faces, and I said the words that I had rehearsed in my head 100 times, but never thought I would actually let slip out. For those who could not be proud, stay silent forever. The applause that followed was polite and steady, but what hit me harder than any cheer was the empty row with a sign that literally had the word family taped across it. I knew that whatever came next would not just be about that moment, it would be about the years that led to it. To anyone else it probably looked like I was keeping my composure, but the second I stepped away from the podium, my phone lit up with vibration after vibration, the kind of frantic rhythm that makes you think there has been a natural disaster. Except the only disaster was inside my own bloodline. I scrolled through message previews. My mom with a crying face typed out in words instead of emojis. My sister demanding I fix the optics. My brother accusing me of humiliating them on live television. Not one of them acknowledged the fact that they had chosen not to show up. Every text read like I had committed the crime, like I had embarrassed them by daring to point out the truth. The truth, though, had been piling up for years. When my mom's blood pressure medication suddenly jumped in price, I was the one who swiped my card at the pharmacy while she said she would Venmo me later, a transfer that never arrived. When my sister wanted to apply to a special training program and claimed she couldn't afford the fee, I put it on my debit card and told her not to worry, thinking she might at least say thank you. Though what I got instead was a snide comment about how she would have made it anyway. When my brother's car broke down and he needed almost $1,000 to replace a transmission, I wired him the money with no interest and no deadlines, just a note that said, "Pay me when you can." He told people afterward that he had taken care of it himself, like my help did not exist. These were not isolated incidents. They were patterns that became the rhythm of my life, me filling in the gaps, them pretending the gaps were never there. That is why the empty seats did not really surprise me as much as they might have surprised an outsider. What surprised me was my own calm. I had spent so long explaining myself, bending explanations into shapes that made their neglect sound reasonable. Yet standing there under the lights, seeing the row of empty chairs, I felt a clarity that did not need more words. I did not shout, I did not list grievances, I just drew a line. And once that line was drawn, I could not erase it even if I wanted to. After the ceremony ended, I walked back with Rosa, the mentor who had been in my corner since the early days when my project was just a messy stack of sticky notes. She looked at me with that half-smile that meant she knew I was about to make a decision I could not walk back from. "Do not explain," she said, quietly but firmly. "You do not owe them a press release. You owe yourself peace." I nodded, and for once I did not argue. Still, I am practical to the core, so instead of throwing a tantrum or going on social media, I opened the admin panel of the center we had built together and scrolled to a setting almost no one else even knew existed: the family and friends lifetime discount code. It was something I had set up quietly when the center launched, a way to make sure that if my mom wanted to join a workshop, or my sister wanted to use our space, or my brother needed tutoring for his kids, they would never have to pay. That night, while the texts kept flooding in, I toggled the discount to inactive. The change would go live at midnight. From that point forward, they would pay the same rate as anyone else, if they ever dared to show their faces there at all. I could have messaged them immediately, could have spelled it out in all caps that the gravy train was closed, but I did not. Instead, I simply replied once to the group thread with 7 words. I said what I meant. Good night. Then I set my phone down on the table and listened as it buzzed for the rest of the evening. The next morning, when the world outside of my family finally started reacting, when the clip of me speaking into the camera began to circulate online, the comments were not mocking or cruel. They were full of people saying, "I wish I had the guts to do that." For the first time, I realized the story was not about my family embarrassing me. It was about me finally refusing to let them keep me quiet. And that realization was just the beginning, because what I discovered in the days to follow would prove that the empty seats were not a coincidence or a scheduling conflict. They were part of a plan. And once I found the proof, I knew exactly what I was going to do with it. When I woke up the morning after that ceremony, my phone felt heavier in my hand than it had ever felt before. Not because the device had changed in weight, but because the endless flood of notifications waiting for me carried the kind of emotional pressure that makes you hesitate before even unlocking the screen. And when I finally swiped it open, what I found was not just the usual stream of defensive texts and half-hearted explanations, but an outright attempt to reframe the entire event as if I had been the one who staged a scene rather than the one who was left staring at a row of empty chairs with a microphone in my hand. My sister Jenna had written the first long message, a rambling wall of words that tried to convince me that what people were talking about online was damaging to our family's image, as if we were some carefully managed brand instead of a fractured group of relatives who could not be bothered to show up on the single day I needed them most. She demanded that before I said anything else publicly, I should consult with them so that we could, in her words, get ahead of the narrative, which was her favorite phrase whenever she wanted to pretend she understood how reputations actually worked. Not long after, Ethan chimed in with his predictable mix of guilt and accusation, telling me that I had made Mom cry on live television and asking whether humiliating our mother in front of the city was really worth it, as though her tears had more to do with my sentence to the camera than with her own decision to skip the event entirely. Reading those words, I realized that what stung the most was not their absence in the chairs, but the audacity to act like my honesty had somehow injured them more than their betrayal had hurt me. And that kind of gaslighting was exactly the pattern that had kept me silent for so many years. Before I could even decide how to respond, a cousin I rarely heard from, Danielle, sent me a screenshot with no introduction, no commentary, just the image itself, and when I opened it, my stomach dropped because it was not a misunderstanding at all. It was proof. The group chat I had been excluded from, where the three of them, my mother, my sister, and my brother, had openly discussed skipping the event to knock me down a peg, with Jenna typing out the exact words, "Let's sit this one out so she doesn't get a big head," and Mom replying with a laughing reaction that made me want to throw the phone across the room. Ethan had added his own comment about how maybe it would teach me that family comes before career, as if my entire life's work was just some hobby that I had pursued to spite them. That screenshot was not just hurtful, it was clarifying, because for the first time I had undeniable evidence that their absence had been coordinated and deliberate, not a scheduling mishap or a sudden emergency, but a strategy meant to undermine me. I stared at the messages for a long while, my hands shaking, not from sadness anymore, but from the clarity that comes when a truth you always suspected is finally laid bare in black and white. And I knew then that whatever happened next could not be me begging or explaining or trying to repair something that had been rotten from the start. I did not post the screenshot publicly, though the temptation was real, because I understood that sometimes the most powerful move is not blasting the truth to the world immediately, but holding it close until the right moment when it cannot be spun or softened. Instead, I replied once in the family thread with a line so simple and so measured that it made Jenna call me 3 times in a row without me picking up. I have all of it. I will not correct the story tonight. I will correct the records. That single sentence was enough to shift the power dynamic, because they understood instantly that I had proof they could not erase, and by withholding it rather than detonating it, I kept them in suspense about what I might do next. At the same time, I quietly forwarded the screenshot and the calendar invite confirmations to the local reporter who had covered the ceremony, not with any rant or complaint, but with a calm note that said, "If asked tomorrow, I will provide documentation." By keeping my tone level and factual, I positioned myself not as the wounded child airing family laundry, but as someone calmly correcting a record, which I knew would hit harder in the long run. Later that afternoon, Danielle sent me another message, this time not a screenshot, but an audio clip she had saved, a short recording where my mom's voice could be heard rehearsing what she would say if people asked why the family had not been at the event. In the recording, Mom tried out a line about an unavoidable family emergency and even practiced pausing for effect, which turned my stomach because it showed not just neglect but premeditated deceit. A willingness to manufacture a story rather than admit the truth. Hearing her voice on that recording was almost worse than reading the group chat because it confirmed that even before the event happened, they had planned their absence and rehearsed their alibi, like my life milestone was nothing more than a backdrop for their performance. I sat there in silence after listening, my jaw clenched, and decided that if they wanted to play this as a performance, then I would play it as documentation. I would not scream, I would not curse, and I would not argue in circles. Instead, I would build a record so complete that if anyone ever questioned what had really happened, there would be no space left for their version to stand. That night, I opened a new folder on my laptop and named it Receipts, dragging in every screenshot, every confirmation, every forwarded message, and every audio file. For the first time in my life, I did not feel like I was hoarding evidence out of paranoia. I felt like I was building the foundation of my own freedom. When Jenna texted again, writing, "We can smooth this over if you stop making it a thing," I did not reply, because what she did not yet understand was that the smoothing over phase of my life was over. The era of me covering, excusing, or bending backwards had ended with those empty seats, and now every choice I made would be deliberate, documented, and irreversible. And while they tried to calculate how much control they still had, I realized with a jolt of certainty that the next move was mine, and mine alone, because the records I held were stronger than any excuse they could ever spin. By the time the second day had rolled into the third, I no longer felt the kind of paralyzing shock that had frozen me when I first saw the group chat or heard my mother's voice rehearsing her excuse. Instead, I felt something much colder, steadier. Almost mechanical, as if my emotions had finally stopped screaming long enough for my mind to start cataloging the sheer number of ways I had been carrying these people without acknowledgement, and it was in that state of almost frightening clarity that I sat down at my desk with Rosa beside me and began the deliberate process of cutting the cords that had allowed my family to tap into my effort, my resources, and my goodwill while still mocking me behind my back. I started with the most obvious connections, the ones I had justified to myself for years as temporary help that had somehow turned into permanent entitlements. Ethan's phone had been part of my family plan for more than 5 years, a decision I had made back when he was between jobs and insisted he just needed a few months of coverage until he got back on his feet, yet 5 years later. The bill still arrived in my inbox each month with his line neatly tucked under mine. Without ceremony, I logged in, unchecked his line, and scheduled the change to take effect at the end of the billing cycle. I knew he would be furious when the service cut out, but I also knew that fury was not my responsibility anymore. Then I moved to my mother's linked pharmacy account, the one that automatically charged her prescriptions to my debit card because she claimed her insurance was complicated and that it was easier if I handled it. I had told myself at the time that if it meant she would actually take her medication on schedule, I could swallow the expense, but what I realized that day was that she had quietly stopped even pretending she would pay me back, as if I had been promoted to unpaid family accountant without my consent. With Rosa watching, I unlinked my card, added a note to the account stating that future charges would be declined, and sent the pharmacy a short message confirming that I was no longer the payer on file. The list went on in ways that made me both furious and embarrassed at my own blindness. I had been covering the rent on a shared storage unit where most of the boxes belonged to Jenna, even though I had not placed a single item there in years, because she had sworn she would settle up once she sold some belongings that, unsurprisingly, she never sold. I had been making automatic transfers to a bank account labeled as a nonprofit initiative she had promised to launch, which turned out to be nothing more than a personal slush fund for her online projects. I had even kept a quiet standing donation running in the background because I thought if I supported her dream, maybe she would support mine, but the empty seats at my ceremony had proven exactly how misplaced that hope had been. Each autopay I canceled, each authorization I revoked, each password I changed felt less like cruelty and more like survival, like I was finally lifting the weight that had been pressing on my chest for years without my even realizing how suffocating it had become. The hardest cut, though, was not financial but symbolic. I had been the emergency contact on all of their forms, schools, doctors, even work applications, because they said I was the reliable one, and for a long time I wore that label like a badge of honor, as if being the one who always picked up the phone meant I mattered. But as I clicked through portal after portal and removed my name, replacing it with theirs, I realized that what they had really meant was I was the one they could dump responsibility on without ever saying thank you. Removing myself was not petty, it was fair. If they wanted to treat me as optional, then I would make myself optional. Once the access points were severed, I went a step further, because part of me knew that if I simply pulled back without documenting the boundaries, they would spin the story into one where I had abandoned them out of spite. So I drafted a short, clear document that I called a release, offering them a choice. If they truly believed they were better off without my interference, then they could sign and agree to terminate any expectation of access, assistance, or claims on my support going forward. It was not hostile. It was almost corporate in its calmness. I sent it with a neutral subject line, for clarity moving forward. And with that, the responsibility shifted from me to them. Jenna replied first, within minutes, writing "fine, send it," as if signing away my help was some kind of victory she had scored, though the undertone of her next sentence gave her away. "But if you go public, I go nuclear." The threat did not sting the way it once might have, because I already knew what she considered nuclear: Instagram stories, a few carefully curated captions, maybe even a dramatic live session, and none of that frightened me anymore. Not when I had receipts that spoke louder than any spin. Ethan's silence was more telling than words, because I knew he had forgotten about the one-page note he had scrawled years ago acknowledging the exact amount of money I had loaned him, signed in his own handwriting, with the date still clear at the top. That single sheet of paper had sat in my drawer for so long I had almost forgotten it, but now, photographed and stored in my growing folder of evidence, it had become the quiet trump card I could play at any time. As the day ended, I closed my laptop and leaned back, exhausted but oddly lighter, because for once I was not reacting out of emotion, but acting out of principle. I had not screamed, I had not begged, and I had not lashed out. I had simply drawn the boundaries in ink, both digital and literal, and dared them to challenge me. And in the silence that followed, broken only by Jenna's empty threats and Ethan's conspicuous quiet, I understood that the narrative had shifted permanently. I was no longer the fixer scrambling to hold the family together. I was the one holding the records, and the records did not lie. When the local reporter called me the next afternoon to follow up on the event, I could tell immediately from her tone that she had already heard whispers from people who had been present, and she wanted to know what had really happened with those glaringly empty chairs at the front row that had "family" written across them in thick marker. For a moment, I considered brushing her off with some vague line about scheduling conflicts or last-minute emergencies, the same way my family no doubt wished I would. But then I realized that the most powerful thing I could do was not embellish or dramatize anything, but simply present the truth in a calm and factual way that could not be twisted. I told her I had the seating chart, the calendar invite confirmations, and even a message thread that made the intent clear, and I also told her that what mattered to me more than the absence of a few relatives was the presence of dozens of volunteers, staff members, parents, and students who had filled the room with genuine pride. She listened quietly, asked a few clarifying questions, and then promised she would handle the story with care, though I already knew that the facts themselves were strong enough to cut through without her adding any commentary. When the piece aired the following day, it did not show me ranting or accusing anyone. It showed the rows of students cheering, the staff smiling, the parents clapping, and then it showed the stark image of the empty chairs at the front, contrasted with the documents I had provided. The reporter explained, in her steady professional voice, that the invitations had been accepted in advance, the seats had been reserved, and no last-minute emergencies had been reported. She closed by pointing out that while the reserved family section sat untouched, the rest of the hall had been filled to capacity with community members who were proud to stand behind the project. That juxtaposition did more for me than any angry speech could have, because it let viewers draw their own conclusion. My family had chosen not to show up, but the community had shown up in full force. The fallout was immediate and predictable. Within hours, Jenna posted a long-winded Instagram story filled with carefully crafted language about how life sometimes throws unexpected curveballs and family matters should not be judged by outsiders. Yet she never once specified what the supposed emergency was, nor did she explain why all three of them had accepted the invites weeks earlier if they knew they might not attend. Ethan remained mostly silent, liking her posts and leaving a vague comment about perspective, but Mom left me a voicemail that made me clench my jaw so tightly I thought my teeth might crack. She said she was heartbroken, that I had made her look bad, that I was airing dirty laundry, and that I should think about how my grandmother would feel if she saw her family divided like this. And then, as if to punctuate the manipulation, she added a threat. Your grandmother's ring, you remember how she said it was yours? If you keep doing this, you will never see it. I might have broken down years ago at a message like that, torn between guilt and anger, but now I just pressed play on another audio clip that Danielle had forwarded to me earlier in the week. One that featured my mother's voice telling Jenna that she planned to give that very same ring to her on her next birthday. Listening to it again, I almost laughed at the absurdity, because the threat of taking something away from me carried no weight once I knew they had already decided to give it to someone else. The manipulation was not just cruel, it was sloppy, and it only confirmed that my instincts to document everything had been correct. Rather than stewing in their threats, I decided to channel my energy into something constructive that would not just cut them off, but would also honor the people who had actually stood by me. That night, I drafted the announcement for what I called the Seats Taken microgrant, a small fund created directly from the money I had freed up by canceling the automatic transfers and perks I had been giving my family. The grant would go to individuals nominated by someone who had shown up for them in real life, whether that meant a teacher who attended every game, a neighbor who always helped with childcare, or a colleague who stayed late to cover for someone in crisis. The point was simple. The empty seats at my ceremony had been a symbol of neglect, so I would turn them into a program that rewarded presence. When we launched the program a week later, the response was overwhelming. Dozens of nominations poured in within days, each one a story of someone who had shown up when it mattered, and reading through them gave me more healing than any apology from my family ever could have. For the first time, I saw in writing that presence was not something I had to beg for, it was something that existed all around me, in people who did not share my blood but who understood the meaning of commitment. By redirecting my resources away from those who had taken them for granted and toward those who actually deserved them, I felt like I was rewriting the rules of what family meant. Of course, my family did not see it that way. Jenna sent me a message dripping with bitterness, accusing me of using charity to cover up bitterness, and Mom sent another voicemail, this time tearful, about how I was destroying the last shred of unity we had left. Ethan, finally cornered, texted to ask whether I had kept that old loan note, clearly remembering too late that he had signed it with his own hand. Their messages no longer shook me, though, because I had moved beyond needing their approval. I had something better: proof, presence, and the beginnings of a new definition of loyalty. And yet, as much as I tried to focus on the positivity of the microgrant and the people who rallied behind it, I knew deep down that one final act was still necessary. The records were in my hands, the boundaries were drawn, and the narrative had begun to shift, but the story was not complete until I showed them, clearly and undeniably, that silence was not just a punishment I had thrown at them in anger. It was the price they would pay for years of taking me for granted. And so, as I stared at the growing folder of evidence on my computer, I began to prepare the last move, the one that would cement everything and make sure the lesson could never be ignored or rewritten. By the time the dust had settled and the article had circulated enough to make its way into every corner of the community, I realized that my family's threats, their crocodile tears, and their attempts to weaponize guilt no longer carried the same weight. Because the narrative was no longer controlled by them, it was now shaped by documents, by proof, and by the undeniable reality that the people who had actually shown up were the ones who mattered. Yet, even with the new microgrant taking off, with messages of support arriving daily from people I had never even met, and with the hollow threats about jewelry and reputations echoing into nothingness, I knew in my bones that there was still one final move I had to make, not because I wanted revenge in the petty sense of the word, but because I wanted to leave no doubt, no loophole. No gap through which they could twist this story back into one where I was the villain and they were the misunderstood victims. So I hosted what I called a thank you night at the center. Nothing glamorous, nothing staged, just an evening with food, laughter, and recognition for the volunteers and supporters who had filled those seats when my family would not. The moment that stood out to me most was watching a 12-year-old boy walk onto the stage with his mother, who had been nominated for the new microgrant because she worked double shifts and still never missed a single school performance. The boy gripped the microphone and said, "She always shows up," and in that second I felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place, because the entire point of what I had been through was never about empty chairs or even about bloodlines. It was about the simple, irrefutable truth that love and loyalty are proven through presence, not through words. When the event wound down and the room was filled with the easy hum of people stacking chairs and exchanging hugs, I asked for a brief moment of quiet so that I could make a short statement on camera. I did not rehearse, I did not script, I just spoke from the clarity that had been building inside me for weeks. I said, I used to audition for my own family, hoping that if I worked hard enough, gave enough, or explained enough, they would be proud of me. I am done with auditions. If you are proud only in private, then stay silent forever. The words did not come out bitter or sharp, they came out steady, as if I had finally reached the point where the line was permanent and the silence was no longer a punishment but a condition of my peace. And then, when the live stream ended, I executed the final step I had been preparing. I dropped the clean, factual record into the world. Not a rant, not an expose dripping with venom, but a file containing the calendar confirmations, the group chat messages, the audio recordings, the auto-pay records, and the signed note from Ethan acknowledging his loan. I sent it to my family first with a simple subject line for the record, and then I made it publicly available to anyone who cared to question what had really happened. There were no names dragged through the mud, no insults, no commentary, just the kind of neutral documentation that speaks louder than any performance. By keeping it clean and undeniable, I stripped them of the only weapon they had left, the ability to spin. The reaction was swift. Jenna messaged me in fury, claiming I had ruined her brand and that I would regret the day I tried to cross her, though her words carried no sting anymore because her brand had never been built on truth. Ethan finally wrote to ask if we could set up a payment plan like adults, as if the loan had not been a casual favor he had once dismissed, and I told him simply that the terms were already outlined in the note he signed. My mother, in her predictable cycle, left another voicemail, this one softer, filled with phrases like devastated and family should never turn on family, followed almost immediately by the familiar request, "Can you pause this story?" For me, I listened to the message twice and then deleted it, because I knew that pausing was exactly what had kept me trapped for years, pausing my own boundaries, pausing my own needs, pausing my own life for the sake of people who never even showed up. The ring, which had been dangled like some inheritance carrot to keep me in line, no longer meant anything, because instead of begging for it or fighting over it, I established something that mattered far more, an annual award named in my grandmother's honor. Given not to a relative, but to a community member who had no family in their front row but showed up anyway. I set the funding aside permanently, documented it with the board, and announced it publicly so that the meaning of her name would live on in a way my family could never twist or withhold. By giving away the symbol they thought they could control, I stripped their leverage and transformed it into something lasting and unassailable. As I stood there that night, watching people laugh, thank one another, and leave with a sense of genuine connection, I realized that my family's silence, once so painful, had become the space I needed to finally hear my own voice. And though the text messages, the voicemails, and the passive-aggressive posts kept coming in waves, I no longer felt shaken by them, because the truth was already out, and the truth does not tremble. In the end, I did not slam the door with cruelty, and I did not offer reconciliation wrapped in false hope. I left them with exactly what I had promised: silence. Silence became the price of their absence. Silence became the consequence of their lies, and silence became the condition under which I would live the rest of my life, surrounded not by those who shared my blood, but by those who proved, again and again, that showing up is what family really means. And as much as they might rage, threaten, or whimper, they could not change the fact that I had finally won, not by fighting louder, but by documenting, by acting, and by refusing to let them rewrite the ending. I walked out of the center that night with no ring, no reconciliation, and no regrets, only the certainty that the next time someone tried to test me with absence or with silence, I would simply smile and remind them of the words that started it all. Stay silent forever.